We live in a culture of Google Maps and GPSs on our phones that tell us the most efficient way to go about our daily journey in the least minutes possible. How can we save 1 or 2 minutes on our drive? Often, this doesn't consider things like the beauty of the trip, which may take 5 minutes longer. And our phones recalibrate as we go along to ensure that we maximize our time and minimize our efforts. That is one way to say that in our culture, our priority on journeys is efficiency. And that is one of our larger, greater cultural values. It's different than the Jews of the first century Palestine, who had their own set of values when it came to journeys. One primary one on the road from Galilee to Jerusalem, the journey Jesus and his disciples travel in this gospel, was the avoidance of Samaria. Though the route was the most direct, if one journeyed through Samaria, Jews despised Samaritans for centuries, following the splitting of the unified kingdom into two in about the 8th century BCE. In fact, you may recall in John's gospel that when Jesus asked the Samaritan woman at the well for a drink, she is shocked, for as John tells us, Jews use nothing in common with Samaritans. In this case, the road. Jesus makes an intentional choice, though, to take the road traveled through a land full of rejected and marginalized people, marginalized by his own people, the Jews, a land full of people rejected. In fact, his disciples wanted to condemn them, we hear. They consumed themselves by the desires of flesh of retribution and vengeance. They wanted the Samaritans to be consumed by what they thought was God's wrath. So that they could maintain their religious and political boundaries, their categories of what counted as a good and a bad person, a superior and an inferior population, so they could feel a sense of superiority and supremacy over Samaritans. Except they missed the most crucial thing: who God really is and where the heart of God makes God's dwelling. In doing so, they missed who God truly is, Jesus, standing right in front of them. I imagine what Jesus might have said when he rebuked them. Jesus, who stands in the line of Hebrew prophets who told the religious and political elites of his day that God was on the side of the Anoim, the poor, the widow, the stranger, the people deemed disposable and discarded. Recall earlier in this year, we've been reading from Luke's gospel throughout this year, that Jesus, maybe somewhat like me, returned to his hometown and read from the scroll of Isaiah, and declared that the Spirit of the Lord was with him to bring glad tidings to the poor. Hopefully you won't try and throw me out like they did to him. And Jesus, in a couple chapters later, will ask, when asked, who is my neighbor, will say, it's not the Levite, not the priest, but the Samaritan, the one who acted neighborly, the one who showed God's mercy and God's compassion. Jesus must have told his disciples that they are to take on that heart of God, which is mercy, compassion, love, outreach. He must have told them that their sense of who is good and bad is skewed, shaped by their own problematic historical and cultural understandings. And he must have told them that to really follow him, to really take on his heart, is to welcome, include, allow all to belong to the year favorable to the Lord. It is true that in this gospel account, the Samaritans may not have heard Jesus' message clearly, but perhaps in their bones they knew, as marginalized people, that their call was to follow God's life fully in their journey by imitating how God was making God's dwelling in their own communities by also caring for marginalized persons. By imitating exactly what Jesus strove to do in his ministry, the very thing that will lead him later to be condemned to death because of jealousy, anger. He took the road less traveled through Samaria. That one involves going through the margins, so much so, as a really good Jesuit friend of mine, Greg Boyle, says, going to the margins so that the margins cease to exist. so that there is no longer an us in them, but simply us. No longer us in them, but simply us. Jesus could have stayed with the values of his day when it came to avoidance, but unlike us who always choose efficiency, he chose the right thing, to go to the, quote, bad Samaritans, because they also are made in God's image and likeness, made very good, actually, made the same as Jesus, who allows God's heart to be made flesh and dwell among us, and to show compassion for the poor and to become a neighbor to the oppressed. And so this is our call. We are called to love our neighbor as ourselves, even though sometimes we don't quite understand how. We are called to not desire destruction of difference, but to serve one another through love, like the Good Samaritan who serves God with mercy. Our call is to imitate Jesus, who in this case takes that route. We are called to say, I will go with you wherever you go, knowing that it might not necessarily feel like home. It might take a stand, sometimes even internally, which make us uncomfortable. But that's what the Hebrew prophets did. Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and more. And that's what Jesus does. Thankfully, we do not do this on our own. We have a community of faith which nurtures us, challenges us, and deepens our faith. A community to lead to freedom so as to love and be like Jesus in the world. And I'll admit that this is where I left the part of my homily in the sacristy, so we're going to make up the ending. But essentially, the ending was that we are a community of faith, and as I said at the beginning of this Mass, this is a community that nurtured me, that challenged me, that strengthened me, that deepened my faith. And I thought of some concrete examples of that, of singing in Kathy O'Connor's folk choir, of telling Father Jim I thought I might have a vocation. Then I said it was to the Jesuits. Of being an aide in confirmation class with with Carol and Carol, and more. So, and I thank you for being a nurturing presence for me in my own life. And I invite us to continue to do so, that we may create the church that Jesus desires, one in which all feel included, welcomed, and able to thrive in the journey towards God.